It is late on a Tuesday in November. The network maps are more than half colored in. The anchors are doing arithmetic on glass screens, and the entire country is staring at one number, 270. That is the magic number, a majority of the Electoral College, the finish line a candidate has to cross to become president. And for as long as you have been alive, on every single election night, somebody has eventually crossed it. So here is a question almost nobody asks, because almost nobody has had to. What happens if nobody crosses it? What if the electoral vote split three ways, or a single state hangs, and no candidate reaches 270 at all? Most people, if you press them, will shrug and say the Supreme Court decides, or Congress votes, or they are honestly not sure. And that uncertainty is the whole point, because the Constitution does have an answer. It was written in 1804. It is called the 12th Amendment, and it is one of the least read, most consequential machines in the entire document. So that is the question for this primer. The 12th Amendment rewired how we elect the president. What happens when no candidate wins an electoral college majority? And why does almost no one know the answer? This is Do It for the Case Law. Doctrine Deep Dives, Season 0. The amendments, one at a time, one sharpest gap each. Today, the 12th. To understand what the 12th Amendment authorizes, you have to see the machine it was built to replace, because the original design broke. And it broke spectacularly, in a constitutional crisis that dragged on from the winter of one year into the next. Here's how the framers first set it up in Article 2. Each state appoints electors, but the original rule did not ask each elector to vote for a president and, separately, for a vice president. It asked each elector to cast two votes, both for president, two names, undifferentiated. Whoever finished first, with a majority, became president. Whoever finished second became vice president. It is a clean design and a fatally naive one because it assumed away political parties. The framers genuinely hoped organized parties would not form, that electors would be wise, independent men choosing the best candidate on the merits. Parties formed almost immediately, and the moment they did, the machine had a flaw waiting inside it. Watch it break. In the election of 1800, the Democratic Republicans ran a ticket. Thomas Jefferson for president, Aaron Burr for vice president. Their electors did exactly what disciplined party electors were supposed to do. Each cast one of his two votes for Jefferson and the other for Burr. And the machine, which could not tell a presidential vote from a vice presidential vote, read the result as a tie. 73 votes for Jefferson, 73 for Burr. A dead heat between the man who was meant to be president and his own running mate. Under the original rules, a tie threw the decision into the House of Representatives, and there it stuck. Ballot after ballot, 36 of them over days, while Burr declined to step aside and the country wondered whether it had a president-elect at all. It took the maneuvering of Alexander Hamilton, no friend of Jefferson, but more afraid of Burr, quietly working the House Federalists to tip the outcome toward Jefferson before the deadlock finally broke. For weeks, the country genuinely did not know who its next president would be, and there was real fear that a young republic might not survive its first bitterly contested transfer of power. The Supreme Court, 2 centuries later in the Chiafalo case we will come to, described that era with some understatement. By then, in its words, everyone had had enough of the Electoral College's original voting rules. The result was the 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804, and its central fix is almost boringly simple, which is exactly why it is easy to miss how much it does. It tells the electors to vote twice, but on 2 separate labeled ballots, one ballot for president, a distinct ballot for vice president. In the court's own summary, the amendment's main part provided that electors would vote separately for president and vice president. The constitutional text puts it this way: the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president. 2 ballots, 2 offices, no more ties born of a machine that could not count what it was looking at. But, and this is the part that sits quietly in the text for a century at a stretch, the 12th Amendment did not just fix the ballots, it also wrote down, in careful detail, what happens when the fix is not enough. What happens when the electors vote cleanly on their 2 separate ballots and still no candidate has a majority. That backup procedure is the other thing the amendment authorizes, and it is where the machine gets strange. Here is the constraint the 12th Amendment builds in, and it is a big one. If no candidate for president has a majority of the electoral votes today, that means nobody reaches 270 out of 538. The choice does not go to a national runoff or back to the voters or to the Supreme Court. It goes to the House of Representatives. But the House does not decide this the way it decides anything else. In this one procedure, the House votes by state delegation. Each state casts one vote. 1. All of the members from California confer among themselves and produce a single vote for the whole state. The lone member from Wyoming casts a single vote too. And those 2 votes, California's 1 and Wyoming's 1, are exactly equal. A state with roughly 40 million people and a state with well under 1 million carry identical weight. To win, a candidate needs a majority of the state's 26 out of 50. Not a majority of representatives, not a majority of Americans, a majority of state delegations. And sit with that math for a moment. The 26 smallest states, taken together, are home to only a modest slice of the country's population. In principle, delegations representing well under half of all Americans could pick the president over delegations representing the clear majority. The rule is simply indifferent to how many people stand behind each state's single vote. The 12th Amendment also narrows the field. Under the broken original system, the House chose from the top 5 finishers. The 12th cuts that down. The House now picks only from the top 3 candidates who received electoral votes. And there is a parallel track for the vice president. If no vice presidential candidate has a majority, that choice goes to the Senate, which picks from the top 2, each senator casting 1 vote, a majority of the whole Senate required. There is even a fail-safe for a House that cannot make up its mind. The amendment set a deadline, and a later amendment, the 20th, moved that deadline to Inauguration Day, so that if the House still has not chosen a president in time, the vice president-elect steps in and acts as president. Gears behind gears. Now, if this all sounds like a hypothetical that could never really happen, it has happened. The country has had to run this machine for real. The first time set the pattern. In the election of 1824, there were 4 serious candidates, and the vote splintered. Andrew Jackson finished first in the popular vote, and first in the Electoral College. But first is not the standard the 12th Amendment cares about. The standard is a majority, and Jackson did not have one. So the presidency dropped into the House of Representatives, to be decided among the top 3, Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and William Crawford. The 4th-place finisher, Henry Clay, was eliminated from the ballot, but Clay happened to be the Speaker of the House, the single most powerful man in the room where the decision would now be made. Clay threw his weight behind Adams, and the House, voting 1 state, 1 vote, made John Quincy Adams the president, the man who had come in second. Jackson's furious supporters called it the corrupt bargain, especially after Adams turned around and named Clay his Secretary of State. Whatever you decide to call it, look hard at the mechanism, because the mechanism is the lesson. The candidate who led the country in votes lost, and a majority of state delegations installed the runner-up. And the Senate has run its half of the machine too. In 1837, it chose the vice president, when no candidate had reached a majority for that office. This is not fiction. It is dormant machinery that has, more than once, woken up and decided who runs the country. Now step back 1 stage in the process, because there is a part of this machine that runs in every single election, majority or not, and it is the part that has drawn the most attention in your lifetime. Before anyone can tell whether a candidate has a majority, somebody has to count, and the 12th Amendment says who opens the envelopes. Here is the text. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. Read that slowly, because of what it does not say. The President of the Senate, that is the Vice President of the United States, shall open the certificates. Then, the votes shall then be counted. Counted by whom? The sentence goes passive at exactly the moment you want a subject. It does not say the Vice President counts them. It does not say Congress counts them. It says they shall be counted, and then it stops. For most of American history, that silence did not matter, because the count was a formality. Then came the election of 1876, where rival slates of electors arrived from multiple states, and Congress had no agreed rule for choosing between them. The dispute was settled by an ad hoc commission and a political bargain, and the country came away understanding that the 12th Amendment's passive voice was a genuine whole. Congress filled it by statute, the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which set out procedures for resolving disputed slates and for how objections are raised and voted on. And I want to be precise about the category here, because it matters. That is a statute, not a constitutional provision and not a court holding. Congress wrote it, and Congress can rewrite it, which it did in 2022, tightening the objection thresholds and stating expressly that the vice president's role in the count is ministerial. So the answer to who counts the votes is not in the 12th Amendment at all. It is in a federal statute, sitting on top of a constitutional sentence that never quite finished its thought. That is an unusual place for the mechanics of a presidential transition to live. And there is one more constraint, the smallest moving part of the whole system, and the place where the 12th Amendment meets modern case law. The amendment tells the electors to vote by ballot. So ask the obvious question. Does that word vote mean the electors are free? If your state votes for one candidate, can the individual human elector defy that and vote for someone else entirely, the so-called faithless elector? The court took a first pass at this in 1952. In Ray v. Blair, Alabama's Democratic Party required candidates for elector to pledge in advance to support the party's nominee, and a would-be elector challenged that requirement. His argument was the intuitive one. Quoting his position as the court described it, the intention of the founders was that presidential electors should exercise their judgment in voting. The court rejected it. As the Chihuahua court later summarized that holding, Ray upheld the pledge requirement, rejecting the argument that the Constitution demands absolute freedom for the elector to vote his own choice. And on the text specifically, quoting Ray, neither the language of Article 2, Section 1, nor that of the 12th Amendment prohibits a state from appointing only electors committed to vote for a party's candidate. History pointed the same way. In the court's words, history teaches that the electors were expected to support the party nominees. But Ray deliberately left the harder half of the question alone. It answered whether a state could demand a pledge. It did not answer whether a state could punish an elector who broke one. The Chiafalo court put it plainly. Ray reserved a question not implicated in the case. Could a state enforce those pledges through legal sanctions? That question sat open for 68 years. In 2020, the Supreme Court finally took it up in Chiafalo versus Washington and answered it a second time the very same day in a companion case out of Colorado, reaching the same result. Let me set the court's own frame first, because in 3 sentences it captures the whole strange structure. Quoting the opinion, every 4 years millions of Americans cast a ballot for a presidential candidate. Their votes, though, actually go towards selecting members of the Electoral College, whom each state appoints based on the popular returns. Those few electors then choose the president. Those few electors. That is the pressure point. Washington state, like many states, required its presidential electors to pledge to vote for the candidate who won the state, and it fined electors who broke that pledge. Some electors broke it anyway and challenged the fine, arguing the Constitution handed them the discretion to vote their conscience. The court disagreed, and it did so unanimously. Here is the holding, verbatim. Today we consider whether a state may also penalize an elector for breaking his pledge and voting for someone other than the presidential candidate who won his state's popular vote. We hold that a state may do so, and here is the reasoning, quoting the court again. The Constitution's text and the nation's history both support allowing a state to enforce an elector's pledge to support his party's nominee and the state voter's choice for president. Then the sentence that matters most for us, because it names this amendment directly. The court said Article 2 in the 12th Amendment gives states broad power over electors and give electors themselves no rights. Read that last clause again. The electors, the human beings the 12th Amendment speaks to directly, the ones it tells to meet in their states and vote by ballot, have, in the court's own words, no rights of their own in that act. The state can bind them, and the state can penalize them. The smallest, most human part of the machine turns out to be a lever the state holds. Which brings us to the gap. For this amendment, the gap is a different species from the ones you find in the Bill of Rights. This is not a loophole inside a promise. The 12th Amendment does not offer you a right and then quietly define it away. The gap here is a tension. The 12th is a live procedural machine, sitting in the Constitution right now, that almost no citizen has ever actually read, and its rules would hand out the presidency in ways that feel deeply counter-majoritarian the moment they switch on. One state, one vote means the national majority is not what decides a contingent election. The arithmetic of state delegations is. A candidate the country actually preferred can lose, exactly as Jackson lost in 1824 to whoever can assemble 26 states. And this is not a museum piece. Picture a single serious third-party candidate who carries even one state, just enough to keep both major party candidates under 270. That is all it takes. The moment nobody clears the majority, the decision leaves the voting booth entirely and moves onto the floor of the House, to be settled state by state, and the person who walks out as president-elect may not be the one who led on election night, or even the one who finished second. And notice this is not a bug the framers overlooked. It is federalism, showing its hard edge. The same principle that gives Wyoming and California 2 senators each shows up here as one state, one vote, and in a genuine deadlock, it would be doing the most consequential thing a constitutional rule can do, picking the president with the least public attention of any rule in the document. Because the machine is invisible precisely until it is not. It sits dormant through every election that produces a clean majority, which is to say through almost all of them, and it only becomes visible in a crisis, in the one election that comes up short, by which point it is far too late to debate the rules. You do not get to redesign the machine while it is running. You play the hand the 1804 text dealt you. And the pattern holds at both ends of the apparatus. At the bottom, Chiafalo converted the last flicker of individual human discretion, the elector's own ballot, into an instrument with, in the court's phrase, no rights of its own. At the top, the sentence that governs the count trails off into the passive voice, and the actual rules for the most dangerous moment in a transition live in a statute Congress can rewrite. From the elector's ballot to the counting of the certificates to the House's state-by-state vote, the 12th Amendment allocates power by structure, by states, by delegations, by procedure, and not by the raw count of what the people wanted. Before we leave that sentence, I want to show you how unsettled it really is, because this is one of those places where the argument is not between lawyers and lay people. It is between serious scholars in law reviews disagreeing flatly with each other. Derek Muller, writing in the Case Western Reserve Law Review in 2023, works through the original public meaning of the 12th Amendment and separates the count into 3 jobs that people constantly blur together: who presides over the joint session, who counts the votes, and who resolves disputes about them. His answer to the first is that the President of the Senate presides, and does it the way any presiding officer of a legislature does, following precedent, parliamentary procedure, and the wishes of the chamber, which means the chamber can constrain her, and in 2022 Congress did exactly that. His answer to the second and third questions is Congress. Congress counts, and because the power to resolve disputes runs with the power to count, Congress resolves them too. Now hold that up against Robert Delahunty and John Yoo, writing in the same law review the year before, in an essay titled Who Counts? They reached the opposite conclusion, that the 12th Amendment and the constitutional history assign the authority to settle disputes over electoral votes to the Vice President, rather than to Congress or to the courts. Same sentence, same amendment. Two published serious readings pointing in opposite directions on the single most consequential question that sentence raises. I am not going to tell you which one is right, because the Supreme Court has never told us either. What I want you to notice is the shape of the problem. When a constitutional provision is clear, scholars argue about its edges. When they are still arguing about its center, about who in a crisis is actually holding the pen, that is not a scholarly dispute, that is a gap in the machine. There is one more piece of modern law worth setting beside this machine, and I want to be careful about exactly what it does and does not decide. In 2023, the Supreme Court decided Moore v. Harper. The case came out of North Carolina and it was about congressional maps, and standing behind it was an argument you may have heard called the independent state legislature theory. The claim that when the Constitution hands a job to the legislature of a state, that legislature answers to no one else inside the state, not the state constitution, not the state courts. The court rejected it. Here is the holding, verbatim. We are asked to decide whether the Elections Clause carves out an exception to this basic principle. We hold that it does not. The Elections Clause does not insulate state legislatures from the ordinary exercise of state judicial review. Now the careful part, I am not going to blur it. That holding is about the Elections Clause, the provision governing congressional elections. It is not a 12th Amendment holding, and I will not pretend it is. But the court did not treat the two provisions as strangers. It examined the parallel clause governing presidential electors right alongside it. It pointed to its own faithless elector decision as the authority on that clause, and it leaned on founding-era state constitutions, including an 1810 Maryland provision requiring every qualified citizen to vote by ballot for electors of the president and vice president, as evidence that legislatures were never understood to be unchecked. So the direction of travel is clear enough, even though the precise question is still open. The people who appoint the electors are not a law unto themselves. And that matters here, because every piece of the machinery we have walked through, the appointment of electors, their two separate ballots, the certificates, the count, runs through a state legislature first. If that first step were genuinely unreviewable, everything downstream would inherit the problem. That is the sample. A full Amendment 12 season on this show would take the machine apart piece by piece. The separate ballot fix, and the 1800 crisis that forced it, the contingent House election and its one state, one vote math, the Senate's quieter role in choosing a vice president, the counting of the certificates and the statute that governs it, and the faithless elector line, from Ray versus Blair through Chiafalo. One procedural question per episode, each anchored in text, in the historical record, and in cases we verify, not remember. A quick word on how this show works. Everything you just heard is legal education, not legal advice. We are teaching how a piece of constitutional machinery is built and how it is actually run, not telling you what to do in any situation of your own. And we are careful about the difference between our sources. The 1800 deadlock and the 1824 contingent election, the two-ballot fix, the one vote per state math, and the 12th Amendment's own words about opening the certificates. Those are the constitutional text and the historical record, and I have described them as history. The Electoral Count Act is a statute, and I have called it one. The two court holdings, Ray versus Blair and Chiafalo versus Washington, were pulled from the Supreme Court's own opinions before I wrote a word of the script, and every citation is in the show notes. Text, history, statute, and verified case law, each labeled as what it is. That is the whole ethos, and it is the name of the show. Do it for the case law. I'll see you at the next amendment.